Everyone thought the old barn was empty until the veteran's German shepherd started digging and uncovered a secret his grandmother hid for decades. When Luke Carter inherited his grandmother's forgotten farm deep in the Bitterroot Mountains of Montana, he thought it was nothing more than a quiet place to sell and move on. The war had followed him home, and peace felt impossible. But the moment his loyal German shepherd, Ranger, stepped into the old barn, something changed. The dog began digging like his life depended on it, and beneath the wooden floor, a secret waited. One that would change Luke's life forever. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, where are you watching this story from today? The night air was cold enough to sting Luke Carter's lungs. He sat in the driver's seat of his aging pickup truck, parked behind a quiet truck stop outside Spokane. The engine was off. The heater had died months ago. His breath fogged the windshield, while snow drifted slowly past the dim parking lot lights. Ranger lay curled across the passenger seat. The German shepherd's thick black and tan coat rose and fell with slow breaths, but his ears twitched at every sound. The distant rumble of a semi-truck, the metallic slam of a fuel pump, the faint shuffle of boots on frozen asphalt. Luke hadn't slept in nearly 2 days. He leaned his head back against the seat and closed his eyes for a moment. Immediately, the memories returned. Dust, gunfire, cracking across a valley. The smell of burning metal. Voices shouting over a radio that had already gone silent. Luke's eyes snapped open again. He exhaled slowly through his teeth. "Easy," he muttered to himself. Ranger lifted his head and studied him. The dog had learned the signs. The shallow breathing, the clenched jaw, the distant look in Luke's eyes that meant the war was creeping back into the present. Ranger stood up, stepped across the seat, and pressed his heavy head against Luke's shoulder. Luke reached up and scratched behind the dog's ear. "You're the only one who sleeps around here," Luke said quietly. Ranger thumped his tail once. Luke glanced around the empty lot. A few truckers were finishing their coffee inside the gas station. Snow gathered along the edge of the pavement. The world felt distant, quiet, almost unreal. 3 months since he left the Marine Corps. 3 months of drifting. No apartment, no job, just an old truck, a duffel bag, and the dog that had kept him alive more times than he could count. The war had taken plenty from him, but it had also given him Ranger. The two of them had met during Luke's final deployment overseas. Ranger had been a military working dog trained to detect explosives and track threats through terrain no machine could navigate. Somewhere in the desert heat, between patrols and sleepless nights, Luke had become Ranger's handler, and Ranger had become Luke's anchor. When Luke left the service, the dog came with him. No one else would have understood him anyway. A faint knock sounded against the truck window. Luke straightened instantly. Ranger's ears shot upright. A man in a heavy coat stood beside the driver's door, holding a clipboard and a stack of envelopes. "Mail delivery," the man said through the glass. Luke blinked in confusion. "Mail?" The man shrugged. "You're Luke Carter?" Luke opened the door halfway. "Yeah?" The man handed him a single envelope and pointed toward the return address. "Law office sent it certified. Been tracking you for a few weeks." Luke frowned. "No idea how they found me. People always get found eventually," the man said with a tired smile before walking back toward a small delivery van. Luke shut the door and stared down at the envelope. Ranger sniffed it immediately. The dog's nose twitched. Then a low growl vibrated deep in his throat. Luke noticed the return address. Henderson and Pike, attorneys at law, Missoula, Montana. Luke felt a strange tightening in his chest. He hadn't been to Montana since he was 7 years old. Slowly, he tore open the envelope. Inside was a letter printed on heavy cream paper. "Luke, we regret to inform you that your grandmother, Eleanor Carter, passed away peacefully on October 14th. As the sole beneficiary listed in her will, you have inherited the Carter family farm, located in the Bitterroot Mountains of Montana. Luke stared at the words. His grandmother, the woman who had refused to take him in when his parents died, the woman who had let the foster system swallow him whole. Luke continued reading. The estate includes 80 acres of land, a residence, a workshop barn, and all personal property belonging to the late Eleanor Carter. You are requested to appear at our office within 30 days to finalize the transfer. Luke let the paper fall slightly. Ranger, he said, quietly. The dog looked up at him. She left me a farm. The words sounded absurd, even as he said them. Luke turned the page. Something slipped free and landed in his lap. It was a second sheet of paper. Older, yellowed, handwritten. The ink looked shaky. Luke unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was thin and uneven, but the name at the top was unmistakable. Luke. His chest tightened. The message was short. Luke, if you're reading this, it means I never got the chance to say it to you myself. I'm sorry. And please, go to the barn first before anyone else does. The room inside the truck felt suddenly smaller. Luke turned the page over. Ho! Nothing else was written. No explanation. Just the signature at the bottom. Eleanor Carter. Ranger sniffed the paper again. This time his growl deepened. Not loud. Just a warning. Luke looked down at him. What is it, boy? Ranger's body stiffened slightly. His eyes locked onto the envelope. The dog's nose hovered above the paper like he could smell something hidden deep inside the fibers. Luke checked the envelope again. Something metallic slid out and landed in his palm. A small key. Old. Rust darkened the edges. Luke rubbed his thumb across the grooves. What the hell did you leave me, Grandma? Outside the truck, the wind picked up. Snow began falling harder. Luke looked out at the dark highway stretching into the mountains. Montana. A farm he had never seen. A grandmother he barely remembered. And a barn that apparently mattered enough to leave behind a warning. Luke folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside the envelope. Ranger watched him the entire time. Then the dog let out one quiet huff. Luke started the truck engine. The heater rattled weakly to life. Well, Luke said, gripping the steering wheel, looks like we're going to Montana. Ranger settled back into the seat, but his eyes stayed on the envelope. And for the first time in weeks, Luke felt something other than exhaustion. Curiosity. The road ahead disappeared into the falling snow, and somewhere beyond those mountains, a barn was waiting. The road into Montana stretched long and silent beneath a pale winter sky. Luke Carter drove, with both hands steady on the steering wheel, the tires humming against frozen asphalt as the highway cut through miles of open country. Snow-covered plains rolled past on either side of the road, broken only by scattered fences and distant barns, standing alone against the horizon. Ranger sat upright in the passenger seat. The German shepherd's ears shifted constantly, alert to every passing sound. His nose pressed against the window as the cold glass fogged beneath his breath. Luke glanced over. You recognize this place or something? Ranger didn't answer, of course, but his tail moved slowly across the seat. Luke turned his eyes back to the road. Montana. He hadn't seen this state since the day a social worker had placed him into the back seat of a government sedan and driven him away from a small farmhouse in the Bitterroot Valley. He had been 7 years old. Old enough to remember the smell of pine trees. Old enough to remember standing on the porch steps, while two adults spoke in quiet, serious voices behind him. Old enough to remember one sentence clearly. She says she can't take the boy. Luke tightened his grip on the wheel. The memory still carried the same weight. It always had. For years, he'd told himself the truth was simple. His grandmother didn't want him, and the foster system had handled the rest. 6 different homes, 3 different schools. One long stretch of years where the only stable thing in his life had been the dream of leaving it all behind. Eventually, he had. The Marine Corps had taken him in when no one else had. The discipline, the structure, the brotherhood. For a while, it had given him purpose. Then came the deployments, the desert heat, the constant tension of patrol routes that could turn deadly without warning. Luke pushed the thoughts away and focused on the road again. The sky ahead had grown darker. Heavy clouds settling over the mountains like a gray blanket. Snow began falling harder. Ranger shifted in his seat. Luke reached over and rubbed the dog's neck. "You remember the sandstorms, huh?" he said quietly. "This is a little different." Ranger leaned into the touch for a moment before returning his attention to the window. They drove another hour before Luke pulled into a small roadside diner just outside the Montana state line. The place was warm, lit by yellow lamps, and the smell of coffee drifting through the cold air as Luke stepped inside. Ranger waited in the truck. The waitress looked up from behind the counter. "You traveling far?" Luke nodded toward the north, Bitterroot Valley. She raised an eyebrow. "Not many people head up there this time of year." Luke gave a faint shrug. "Family business." The words felt strange in his mouth. Family. The coffee came hot and strong. Luke wrapped his hands around the mug, letting the warmth sink into his fingers. Outside the window, Ranger sat watchfully in the truck. Luke thought about the letter again. Eleanor. Carter. All. The name felt distant, like something from someone else's life. He remembered her face only vaguely. A woman with silver hair, tied back in a braid. Strong hands rough from years of work. She had smelled like sawdust. That detail stayed with him for some reason. Luke finished the coffee, paid the bill, and stepped back into the cold evening air. Ranger greeted him with a low bark and wagging tail. "Miss me already?" The dog huffed and climbed back into the passenger seat. Night settled across the highway as Luke drove deeper into the mountains. The terrain began to change. Flat land gave way to winding roads, climbing through dark forests of pine and cedar. Snow clung to the branches, glowing pale beneath the headlights. The Bitterroot Mountains rose like shadows ahead. Luke slowed as the road narrowed. Ranger suddenly leaned forward. His body stiffened. The dog's ears stood straight up. Luke noticed the change instantly. "What is it?" Ranger's nose pressed hard against the windshield. The dog gave a low, restless whine. Luke followed his gaze. The valley opened below them. Far in the distance, faint lights scattered across the land, where small homes and farms dotted the snow-covered fields. Luke felt something strange in his chest. He hadn't expected the place to look familiar. But it did. The shape of the hills, the curve of the river, reflecting moonlight. It stirred something buried deep in his memory. Ranger barked once, sharp, excited. Luke glanced over again. "You've definitely been here before." He slowed the truck as the GPS on his phone flickered to life. Carter Farm. 4 miles. Luke stared at the screen. 4 miles. After 25 years, Ranger's tail began thumping harder now. The closer they drove, the more restless the dog became. Finally, the paved road ended. A narrow gravel driveway stretched into the forest. Luke turned the truck onto it. Snow crunched under the tires. Tall pine trees closed in around them as the truck crawled forward through the quiet darkness. Then the trees parted. Luke eased his foot off the gas. There it was, the Carter farm. The farmhouse stood at the center of a wide clearing, its wooden porch sagging slightly under the weight of snow. A red barn stood several yards behind it, its tall doors facing the open field. Moonlight spilled across 80 acres of silent land. Luke shut off the engine. The sudden quiet felt enormous. For a moment, neither he nor Ranger moved. Then Ranger jumped down from the seat. The dog landed in the snow and immediately lifted his head, sniffing the cold air. Luke stepped out of the truck. The mountains towered around the valley like dark guardians. Pine trees whispered softly in the wind. Luke looked at the farmhouse. Then the barn. The letter echoed again in his mind. Go to the barn first. Ranger suddenly sprinted across the yard, straight toward the barn. Ranger! Luke followed quickly through the snow. The dog had already reached the tall wooden doors. Ranger circled the building once, then twice. Then he began scratching frantically at the ground near the barn wall. Snow flew behind him. As his paws dug deeper, Luke reached the dog and grabbed his collar gently. Hey, easy. But Ranger kept pulling toward the ground, whining, now determined. Luke looked down at the spot. Beneath the thin layer of snow, the dog had uncovered old wooden boards built into earth beside the barn. Luke felt his pulse quicken. What did you find? Ranger barked again. The sound echoed across the silent valley. Luke turned slowly toward the barn doors. The wind creaked them slightly open. Darkness waited inside, and somewhere beneath that floor, something was buried. Luke Carter stood in the snow, staring at the ground Ranger had uncovered beside the barn. The boards were old, weathered, half hidden beneath packed dirt and frost. Ranger pawed at them again, letting out an impatient whine, as if urging Luke to hurry. Hold on, boy, Luke murmured. His breath hung in the cold air as he knelt down. The wood felt solid beneath his gloves, not part of the natural ground. These boards had been placed here intentionally, long ago. Luke glanced toward the barn doors again. The wind pushed one of them open with a long wooden groan. The sound echoed across the quiet valley. Ranger lifted his head instantly. Luke followed the dog's gaze. The barn interior lay dark and silent, the kind of darkness that swallowed the light instead of reflecting it. Luke stood slowly. Let's see what Grandma was hiding. He grabbed a flashlight from the truck and returned to the barn doors. Ranger walked beside him, alert and steady. Luke pushed the doors open. The hinges protested loudly, but the doors swung wide enough for the beam of the flashlight to cut through the darkness. Dust floated through the air like tiny stars. The smell hit him first. Wood shavings, old oil, and something familiar he hadn't smelled in years. Fresh-cut lumber. Luke stepped inside. The barn was bigger than he expected. But it wasn't a barn. Not really. The wide space had been converted into something else entirely. Workbenches lined the walls. Heavy clamps hung from wooden racks. Saws, chisels, and carving tools were arranged neatly across a long central table. Stacks of finished furniture stood along the far wall. Chairs, tables, cabinets, each piece crafted from rich, dark wood, polished smooth and glowing softly in the flashlight beam. Luke slowly turned in a circle. This isn't a barn, he whispered. Ranger padded forward, sniffing the ground. Luke approached one of the workbenches. His fingers brushed the surface of a table Eleanor Carter must have built herself. The craftsmanship was incredible. The edges were carved with delicate patterns of mountain wildflowers. The wood grain ran perfectly through every joint. Luke exhaled slowly. She was a woodworker. The thought settled strangely in his chest. He had spent his entire childhood believing his grandmother lived quietly somewhere in Montana, barely remembering he existed. But this workshop told a different story. This had been someone's life, someone's passion. Luke moved deeper into the barn. Against the back wall stood a tall wooden cabinet. The doors creaked open when he pulled them. Inside were dozens of notebooks. Luke picked one up, and flipped it open. Measurements, sketches, detailed plans for furniture designs. Each page filled with Eleanor Carter's handwriting. Luke smiled faintly. She was busy. Ranger barked once behind him. Luke turned. The dog stood near the center of the barn floor now, scratching again, right at the spot where the boards lay buried outside. Luke walked over. The beam of the flashlight revealed something he hadn't noticed before, a faint seam in the wooden floor. 2 long boards cut slightly shorter than the rest. Luke crouched down. Ranger sat beside him, tail sweeping slowly across the dusty ground. "You've got good instincts," Luke said. He ran his fingers along the edge of the seam. The boards shifted slightly. Luke pulled harder. The wood lifted. Beneath it was a shallow compartment. Inside sat a small wooden box. Luke froze. The box looked handmade, smooth walnut, with clean corners and careful craftsmanship. It was about the size of a shoebox, and it was locked. Ranger leaned closer, sniffing it carefully. Luke lifted the box from the compartment. It was heavier than it looked. He turned it over in his hands. Carved into the lid and were words that made his chest tighten. "For Luke, she made this for me," he whispered. The lock was small, old. Luke reached into his pocket slowly. The rusty key Eleanor's letter had contained rested in his palm. Ranger watched him closely. "You think this is it?" Luke said softly. He slid the key into the lock, but it didn't turn. Luke frowned. He tried again. Still nothing. "Guess I'm not ready yet." He set the box on the workbench. Ranger gave a small, frustrated huff. Luke laughed quietly. "Relax, partner. We'll figure it out." A faint sound drifted in from outside, the crunch of tires on snow. Luke's head snapped toward the barn doors. Ranger was already moving. The dog's ears flattened as he trotted to the entrance. Luke stepped outside behind him. Headlights rolled slowly up the driveway. A pickup truck, older model. The engine shut off as it reached the yard. An elderly man climbed out. He wore a thick winter coat and a wool cap pulled low over his ears. He studied Luke for a moment before speaking. "You must be Eleanor's grandson." Luke nodded cautiously. "Luke Carter." The man approached, extending a gloved hand. "Walter Hayes. Been your neighbor for 30 years. Luke shook his hand. Walter glanced toward the barn. "She always said you might come back one day." Luke felt a strange twist in his stomach. "She said that?" Walter nodded. "Talked about you all the time. To have. Dot." Walter nodded. Luke didn't know what to say. Walter looked toward the barn doors again. "You been inside yet?" "Yeah." Walter chuckled softly. "Whole town knows about that workshop. Eleanor made the finest furniture in 3 counties. Luke leaned against the barn wall. "Wish I'd known that." Walter's expression softened. "She was proud of you, son." Luke stared at the snow for a moment. Didn't seem like it. Walter hesitated. Then he sighed. "Well, there's some things you ought to know." Luke looked up. Walter's voice lowered. "Your grandmother had trouble these last few years." Luke's stomach tightened again. "What kind of trouble?" Walter glanced down the driveway. "Man named Harold Grayson." The name meant nothing to Luke. "Who's that?" Walter's face darkened slightly. "A man who's been trying real hard to buy this land." Luke looked around at the farm. The quiet valley, the barn, the workshop. "Why?" Walter shrugged slowly. "That's the part nobody understands." The wind moved through the trees again. Walter looked back toward the barn one more time. "And if he hears you're here," the old man said quietly, "he'll probably come knocking." Ranger let out a low growl. The sound rumbled deep in his chest. And somewhere in the mountains beyond the valley, a storm was beginning to move in. The wind arrived first. It slid down the Bitterroot Mountains like a slow breath of winter, stirring the tall pine trees that surrounded Carter Farm. Their branches whispered together, bending under the weight of fresh snow as dark clouds gathered over the peaks. Luke Carter stood beside the barn doors, watching the sky change. Walter Hayes pulled his coat tighter. "Storm's coming early tonight," the old man said. "These mountain ones can drop a foot of snow before morning." Luke nodded, but didn't look away from the barn. His thoughts kept returning to the wooden box sitting on the workbench inside, the one with his name carved into the lid. Walter followed his gaze. "You find anything interesting in there?" Luke hesitated. "Maybe." Walter chuckled softly. Eleanor always did like her secrets. Ranger stood between them, his nose lifted toward the wind. The dog's ears twitched constantly, as if listening to something far away. Walter crouched down and scratched the dog behind the ear. "Fine animal," he said. "Military dog," Luke replied. Walter nodded slowly. "That explains the eyes." The old man straightened and looked toward the farmhouse. "You staying the night?" Luke glanced at the house. The porch light was dark. Snow had gathered against the steps, untouched for weeks. "I guess so." Walter pointed toward the driveway. "If you need anything, my place is a mile down the road. Blue roof, can't miss it. Thanks." Walter climbed back into his truck. The engine started with a rumble before the headlights swung across the yard. "Good to see you, Carter. Back on this land," he called through the window. Then he drove off into the falling snow. Luke stood alone again. The valley had grown quiet. Ranger trotted toward the farmhouse, but stopped halfway, turning his head back toward the barn. Luke noticed. "You like the barn better, huh?" The dog barked once. Luke laughed softly. "All right, let's take another look." They stepped inside again. The barn felt warmer somehow, protected from the wind outside. Luke shut the doors behind them and turned on the flashlight. The beam swept across the workshop. Tools gleamed along the walls. Handcrafted furniture stood neatly arranged like silent witnesses. Luke walked toward the workbench where the wooden box waited. Ranger followed closely. Luke rested his hands on the table. The box looked even older up close. His grandmother had carved it with careful precision. Every edge was smooth, every line straight. She had spent time making this. For him, Luke ran his thumb across the carved letters of his name. For Luke. The words stirred something deep in his chest. He had spent years believing Eleanor Carter barely remembered he existed. But this box told a different story. Luke sat down slowly on a nearby stool. Ranger settled beside him, his body leaning lightly against Luke's leg. Luke stared at the box for a long time. Then he stood again. Let's see what else she left behind. He began exploring the workshop more carefully. A tall shelf along the wall held several small video cameras. Luke frowned. He picked one up. Old digital recorders. Next to them sat dozens of labeled memory cards. Each one had a date written in Eleanor's handwriting. Luke grabbed a nearby laptop sitting on a wooden desk. Surprisingly, it powered on. The screen flickered to life. Luke inserted one of the memory cards. The video opened. The image showed Eleanor Carter, standing right where Luke now stood. She looked older than Luke remembered. Her hair had turned fully white, braided down her back. Her hands were dusted with sawdust, but her eyes were sharp, strong. Day 214, she said into the camera. I'm finishing the walnut dining table today. She turned the camera slightly to show the piece she had been working on. Luke leaned closer to the screen. It was the same table standing behind him now. Eleanor spoke calmly as she worked. Wood remembers everything, she said. Every storm, every season. Luke felt his throat tighten. He had never heard her voice as an adult before. He watched several more clips. In each one, she explained tools, techniques, designs. But every so often, she would pause and speak directly to the camera. Luke would like this one. Or, if he ever comes back, he should learn this first. Luke sat back slowly. She expected me to come here. Ranger wagged his tail gently. Luke inserted another memory card. The video opened. But this one was different. Eleanor wasn't working. She sat at the desk looking directly into the camera. Her expression was serious. "Luke," she said quietly, "if you're watching this, it means I'm probably gone." Luke leaned closer to the screen. The barn felt suddenly very quiet. Eleanor took a slow breath. "There's something you need to know about this land." Luke felt Ranger shift beside him. The dog had turned toward the barn doors again. His ears stood straight up. Luke paused the video. "What is it?" Ranger let out a low warning growl. Luke turned off the flashlight. For a moment, the barn sat in darkness. Then Luke heard it too. Footsteps. Outside. Crunching slowly through the snow. Luke's hand moved automatically toward the old wrench, lying on the workbench. Ranger moved closer to the doors, his body tense. The footsteps stopped. Then came a knock. 3 slow knocks against the barn door. Luke looked at Ranger. The dog didn't bark. A div. But the growl deep in his chest grew louder. Luke stepped toward the door cautiously. "Yeah?" A voice answered from outside. Smooth. Confident. "You must be Luke Carter." Luke froze. "Who's asking?" The voice replied calmly. "My name is Harold Grayson." Luke remembered Walter's warning immediately. The man trying to buy the land. Luke opened the door halfway. A tall man stood outside beneath the falling snow. Expensive coat, polished boots, silver hair perfectly combed. Harold Grayson smiled politely. "I was hoping we could talk about your grandmother's farm." Behind Luke, Ranger's growl deepened, and the storm outside continued to grow stronger. Snow swirled in the cold air between the barn doors as Luke Carter stared at the man standing in front of him. Harold Grayson looked like he belonged in a city office tower, not on a mountain farm. His dark overcoat was expensive wool. His boots were polished leather that hadn't touched real mud in years. Snowflakes landed on his silver hair, but he didn't seem to notice. He smiled calmly. "Evening, Mr. Carter." Luke didn't move. "What do you want?" Grayson's eyes drifted past Luke, peering into the barn. "Ah," he said softly. "So, you've seen Eleanor's workshop." Luke stepped forward, blocking the view. "That's none of your business." Ranger took one slow step closer to the door. The German shepherd's posture had changed completely now. His shoulders were tight, his tail stiff, his dark eyes locked on the stranger like a soldier assessing a threat. Grayson noticed. "Impressive dog." Luke's voice remained flat. "He doesn't like strangers." Grayson chuckled politely. "Well, I'm afraid we'll have to become acquainted." The wind gusted again, rattling the barn doors. Snow blew across the yard behind him in long white streaks. Luke crossed his arms. "You drove all the way out here in a storm. Just to introduce yourself?" Grayson reached slowly into the inside pocket of his coat. Luke's muscles tensed instantly. Ranger's growl deepened into a warning rumble. Grayson paused. "Relax," he said, pulling out a thin leather folder. "Just paperwork." He opened it and removed several documents. "I came because of your grandmother." Luke's expression hardened. "What about her?" Grayson held out the papers. "She owed me money." Luke didn't take them. "For what?" Grayson spoke in the calm voice of someone used to getting his way. "Your grandmother Commissioned several large furniture projects through my company 3 years ago. High-end, custom pieces. Walnut, cherry, imported hardwood. Luke frowned. She made furniture. She didn't buy it. Grayson nodded patiently. She designed pieces for my clients. Unfortunately, she never completed the final order. Luke glanced at the papers again. So, Grayson tapped the top page. The remaining balance is $35,000. The number hung in the air like a cold gust of wind. Luke stared at him. You're telling me my grandmother owed you 35 grand? Grayson nodded once. And now that she's passed, the debt transfers to the estate. Luke laughed once, but there was no humor in it. You think I've got $35,000? Grayson studied him carefully. I imagine not. The man stepped slightly closer, lowering his voice. That's why I came to offer you a solution. Luke said nothing. Grayson gestured slowly toward the farm. The land. Luke's eyes narrowed. This property is worth considerably more than the debt, but I'm willing to be generous. The word sounded wrong in the quiet barn. I'll purchase the farm from you, Grayson continued. You pay off the debt, keep a little money for yourself, and walk away clean. Luke stared at the snow blowing across the doorway. Walk away. Grayson nodded. Seems like the practical choice. Ranger barked suddenly. Sharp warning. Luke reached down and rested a hand on the dog's back. Grayson's eyes flicked briefly to the animal again. Look around you, Mr. Carter, he said gently. This land requires maintenance, equipment, time. He glanced at Luke's truck sitting in the driveway. You're a veteran, correct? Luke's jaw tightened. Yeah. Grayson smiled faintly. You've served your country. That's admirable. His voice softened slightly. But this place isn't built for someone starting over. Luke felt a slow heat rising in his chest. What exactly are you saying? Grayson leaned a little closer. I'm saying a man living out of his truck probably can't afford to keep a farm. The words hung there, heavy. Luke's hands curled into fists. Ranger sensed the shift immediately and stepped forward again, placing himself between Luke and the stranger. Grayson raised his hands calmly. No offense meant. Luke's voice dropped low. Then you should choose your words better. For a moment, the only sound in the barn was the wind pushing against the walls. Grayson sighed softly. I'll be honest with you, Mr. Carter. He tapped the papers again. You have 60 days to settle this debt. After that, the claim goes to court. Luke stared at him. And if I don't pay? Grayson gave a small shrug. Then the property becomes mine. The words felt like a stone dropping into Luke's stomach. Grayson slid the folder back into his coat. I'll return in a few days. Think it over. He stepped back into the snow. Luke watched him walk toward a sleek black SUV parked near the road. Before opening the door, Grayson turned once more. Oh, he added casually, you might want to check your grandmother's records. Luke didn't respond. Grayson smiled again. She kept very detailed ones. Then he climbed into the vehicle. The engine started. Headlights cut through the snowstorm as the SUV slowly disappeared down the driveway. The yard fell silent again. Luke stood in the barn doorway, long after the sound of the engine faded. Ranger looked up at him. Luke exhaled slowly. Well, that was friendly. He turned back into the workshop. The wooden box still sat on the workbench. The laptop screen still glowed faintly with the paused video of Eleanor Carter staring into the camera. Luke walked back to the desk and pressed play. The video resumed. Eleanor looked tired, older, but her voice remained steady. Luke, she said softly, if anyone tells you I owed them money, Don't believe them. Luke's eyes widened. Eleanor leaned closer to the camera. There are people who've been waiting a long time for this land. The barn creaked as the wind pushed against the walls. Eleanor's voice continued through the speakers. If you're watching this, it means they're probably already looking for something. Luke felt Ranger move closer beside him. What something? Luke whispered. On the screen. Eleanor paused. Then she spoke the words that made Luke's heart begin to pound. They think it's hidden in the barn. Outside, thunder rolled across the mountains. And for the first time since arriving, Luke Carter realized he might have inherited far more than a farm. The storm outside had settled into a steady fall of snow. Thick flakes drifting past the barn windows, like slow white feathers. Inside the workshop, the only light came from the laptop screen and the small lantern Luke had found hanging near the workbench. Ranger lay beside him, head resting on his paws, but his ears remained alert. Luke leaned closer to the screen. Eleanor Carter sat in the video frame, her hands folded on the desk in front of her. The camera had been placed carefully, so the workshop filled the background behind her. For a long moment, she didn't speak. When she finally did, her voice was softer than before. Luke, she said, I know you probably grew up believing I abandoned you. The words hit Luke harder than he expected. He swallowed slowly. Eleanor looked down briefly before continuing. That was never the truth. Luke leaned forward. I tried to find you, she said. The barn creaked quietly as wind brushed along the outer walls. Eleanor reached beside the camera and lifted a small stack of envelopes. I wrote to every address they gave me. She held them up to the lens. They all came back. Luke's chest tightened. Eleanor continued. The foster agency said you had been moved again and again. Her voice trembled slightly now. I never stopped trying. Luke felt something shift inside him, something heavy he'd been carrying most of his life. He had always imagined a simple explanation. She didn't want him. That belief had followed him through every foster home, every lonely birthday, every Christmas where other kids went home with families. But the woman on the screen looked heartbroken. I should have fought harder, Eleanor whispered. Luke's throat burned. Ranger lifted his head and nudged Luke's hand. Luke rubbed the dog's neck absent-mindedly while watching the screen. Eleanor placed the envelopes on the desk. You'll find the rest in the cabinet behind the workbench. Luke turned his head slowly toward the tall wooden cabinet he had opened earlier. He stood and crossed the workshop. The cabinet doors creaked as he opened them again. Inside sat a wooden crate he hadn't noticed before. Luke lifted it down carefully. It was heavier than it looked. He carried it back to the desk and opened the lid. The box was filled to the top. Letters. Hundreds of them. Luke picked one up. The envelope was yellowed with age. Across the front, written in Eleanor's neat handwriting, was his name, Luke Carter. But below the address was a thick red stamp. Return to sender. Luke grabbed another envelope, same stamp. Another, and another. Every letter had been sent back. Luke sat down slowly. There must have been 200 of them. Maybe more. Ranger rested his chin on Luke's knee. Luke opened the first letter. The paper crackled softly as he unfolded it. Dear Luke, I hope wherever you are tonight, you're warm and safe. I don't know if this letter will reach you, but I will keep writing until it does. Luke read the words slowly. Each letter told a piece of a story he had never known. Eleanor described the farm, the mountains, the furniture she was building. Sometimes she wrote about simple things. The first snowfall of winter, a new puppy born on Walter Hayes's ranch down the road. Other times, she wrote about Luke himself. I wonder if you still like the smell of pine trees. You used to pick up every pine cone you could find. Luke closed his eyes for a moment. He remembered that. A little boy filling his pockets with pine cones on a mountain trail. He hadn't thought about that day in decades. Luke opened another letter. And another. The hours passed quietly. Outside, the storm deepened, covering the farm in fresh snow. Inside the barn, Luke read. Some letters were short. Others ran several pages long. One had a photograph tucked inside, a picture of the barn taken years earlier. Another contained a small hand-drawn map of the valley. Luke eventually reached one written only 2 months before Eleanor had died. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded it. Dear Luke, if this letter ever reaches you, there's something important I need you to understand. A man named Harold Grayson has been coming to the farm. He claims I owe him money, but I never signed anything with him. He keeps asking about the workshop, about the barn, about something he believes I'm hiding. Luke's heart began to beat faster. He continued reading. I believe he's waiting for me to die so he can take the land. If that happens, and if you ever come back here, do not trust him. Luke slowly lowered the paper. Ranger lifted his head, sensing the tension. Luke looked toward the wooden box sitting on the workbench, the one with his name carved into it. For Luke, when you are ready. Luke stood up. The barn felt different now. He could almost feel Eleanor's presence lingering in the workshop. Her tools still hung where she had left them. Her unfinished projects stood along the walls. This place had been her life, and now someone wanted to take it. Luke walked to the workbench. He picked up the wooden box again. Ranger stood beside him. You think this is what he's looking for? Luke asked quietly. The dog sniffed the box carefully. Then Ranger turned his head toward the barn doors. His ears flattened suddenly. Luke froze. The dog had gone perfectly still. Then Ranger stood slowly, silently. A low growl formed in his chest. Luke turned toward the door. At first, he heard nothing. Then a faint crunch of footsteps outside. Someone was walking through the snow again. Luke's hand closed around the heavy wrench lying on the workbench. Ranger moved closer to the door. The growl deepened. The footsteps stopped just outside the barn. Luke held his breath. The lantern flickered, and in the silence of the snowy valley, the barn door handle slowly began to turn. Luke Carter didn't move. His hand tightened around the heavy wrench from the workbench. The cold metal pressed against his palm as he watched the door. Ranger stood beside him, body low, muscles tense. The German Shepherd's growl vibrated through the wooden floorboards. The handle turned another inch. Then the door pushed inward. A gust of snow blew into the barn. For a moment, the doorway was empty. Then a dark figure stepped inside. Luke raised the wrench. Stop right there. The man froze. He lifted both hands, slowly. Easy, easy, the stranger said quickly. I'm not here to cause trouble. Luke didn't lower the wrench. Then, start explaining why you're sneaking into my barn at midnight. The man looked around the workshop nervously. Snow clung to his jacket and boots. He looked younger than Luke had expected, maybe mid-30s, with tired eyes and a nervous expression. I thought the place was empty, he said. Ranger stepped forward. The growl deepened. The man's eyes widened when he saw the dog. Whoa, that's a serious dog. Luke remained perfectly still. Answer the question. The man swallowed. I was looking for something. Luke felt his stomach tighten. What something? The man hesitated. Before he could answer, another sound came from outside. An engine. Headlights flashed across the barn walls. The stranger's face went pale. Oh, no, he whispered. Luke frowned. What? The man backed away from the door. Those aren't my friends, Ranger barked sharply. Luke turned toward the entrance, just as 2 more figures stepped through the snowstorm. Both wore heavy coats, with their collars pulled high. One of them spoke immediately. There he is. Luke felt the tension in the air change instantly. These men weren't lost travelers. They walked with purpose. One of them looked at Luke. You? Luke Carter? Luke didn't answer. Ranger stood directly in front of him now. The first man smiled coldly. Mr. Grayson asked us to check on something. Luke's chest tightened. What kind of something? The second man stepped closer, scanning the workshop. Something your grandmother hid. Luke glanced at the wooden box on the workbench. The first man followed his gaze. There it is. Before Luke could react, the men moved fast. The younger stranger near the door tried to step away. Hey, wait. One of the men shoved him aside. The other reached toward the workbench. That was the moment Ranger launched forward. The German Shepherd moved like a streak of muscle and fur. His bark exploded through the barn. The man, reaching for the box, barely had time to react before Ranger collided with him. The impact knocked the man backward into a stack of wooden chairs. They crashed to the floor. The second man cursed and reached into his jacket. Luke didn't wait. He swung the wrench. The metal tool struck the man's arm, knocking whatever he had been reaching for onto the floor. The man stumbled back with a shout. Get the dog off. Ranger stood over the first attacker now, teeth bared, growling like thunder. The man on the ground tried to push himself up. Ranger snapped the air inches from his face. The message was clear. Don't move. Luke stepped forward. Get out. The second man glared at him. You don't understand what you're messing with. Luke raised the wrench again. Try me. For a moment, no one moved. Then the man on the floor suddenly reached for something in his boot. Ranger reacted instantly, but the man was fast. A small blade flashed in the lantern light. Luke saw it a fraction of a second too late. The knife swung toward the dog. Ranger twisted away, but not completely. The blade sliced across his shoulder. The German Shepherd yelped. The sound hit Luke like a punch to the chest. Ranger! The dog stumbled back, blood darkening the fur along his side. Luke's vision narrowed. Every sound in the barn faded, except the pounding of his own heartbeat. The man scrambled to his feet. Move! Both intruders rushed for the door. Luke lunged after them, but stopped when Ranger staggered beside him. The SUV engine roared to life outside. Tires spun through the snow. By the time Luke reached the door, the vehicle was already disappearing down the mountain road. The taillights vanished into the storm. Luke didn't care. He dropped to his knees beside Ranger. Hey, buddy. The dog lay on the barn floor, breathing fast. Blood soaked into the sawdust. Luke's hands trembled as he pressed his jacket against the wound. You're okay, Luke whispered. You're okay. Ranger looked up at him. Even in pain, the dog's tail gave a weak thump against the floor. Luke swallowed hard. We're getting you help. He lifted the dog carefully into his arms. Ranger weighed nearly 80 pounds, but Luke barely noticed. The adrenaline pushed everything else away. The snow outside had turned into a full blizzard. Wind howled through the valley. Luke carried Ranger to the truck and laid him across the passenger seat. The dog's breathing was shallow now. Luke started the engine. Stay with me, partner. The truck's headlights cut through the swirling snow as Luke turned onto the narrow mountain road. The steering wheel shook beneath his hands. The nearest town was 15 miles away. Luke kept talking the entire drive. You remember Kandahar? Ranger blinked slowly. You got me through that one. Luke wiped snow from the windshield. So, don't quit on me now. The truck raced through the storm. Behind them, Carter Farm disappeared into the darkness. And somewhere out in that snowy valley, two men were already reporting back to Harold Grayson. But Luke Carter didn't know that yet. All he could see was the narrow mountain road, and the snowstorm swallowing everything beyond the truck's headlights. The windshield wipers struggled to keep up. Snow hammered against the glass in thick waves as the pickup truck crawled down the winding road toward the nearest town. Ranger lay across the passenger seat. Luke kept one hand pressed firmly against the dog's shoulder to slow the bleeding. "Stay with me, partner," he said again. Ranger's breathing was shallow but steady. The German shepherd lifted his head slightly and licked Luke's wrist. The small gesture nearly broke him. Luke swallowed the lump in his throat. "Don't worry," he murmured. "You're tougher than me." The road curved sharply along the mountainside. Luke slowed the truck as ice covered the pavement. He had driven this kind of road before: convoys through desert cliffs, mountain passes overseas, where a single mistake meant disaster. But this time his heart was pounding for a different reason. Every few seconds he glanced at Ranger. The dog's eyes stayed on him the whole time, trusting, always trusting. After 20 long minutes, the lights of a small town appeared through the storm. A single main street, a gas station, a diner, and a small building with a glowing green cross. Veterinary clinic. Luke pulled into the lot and slammed the truck into park. He rushed around the hood and lifted Ranger into his arms. The clinic door burst open before he even reached it. A woman in a blue coat stepped out. "What happened?" "Knife wound," Luke said quickly. "Shoulder." The woman immediately cleared the way. "Bring him inside." Warm air wrapped around them as Luke carried Ranger into the clinic. Bright lights filled the room. The woman guided him to a metal exam table. "I'm Dr. Melissa Grant," she said calmly. "You're okay, Ranger. Let's take care of you." Luke stepped back as she began examining the wound. Blood had soaked through the dog's fur, but the veterinarian moved quickly and confidently. "It's a deep cut," she said, "but it missed anything critical." Luke felt his shoulders drop slightly. "He'll need stitches." Ranger watched Luke the entire time. The dog never once growled or resisted. "Doctor." Grant cleaned the wound and began stitching. Luke sat quietly on a wooden chair nearby. The adrenaline from the attack had faded. Now, exhaustion settled in its place. Outside, the storm raged harder. Snow drifted across the windows. Dr. Grant finished the final stitch and wrapped Ranger's shoulder carefully. "He'll be sore for a few days," she said, "but he'll recover." Luke exhaled slowly. "Thank you." She gave Ranger a gentle pat. "He's a brave dog." Luke nodded. "Yeah." Dr. Grant studied Luke for a moment. "You're new in town. Just arrived today. Where are you staying?" "Carter Farm." Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "Eleanor Carter's place?" Luke nodded. "She was my grandmother." Dr. Grant smiled softly. "She built the dining table in my house." Luke looked surprised. "She sold furniture here?" "Oh, yes," the veterinarian said. "Everyone in this valley owns something she made." Luke looked down at Ranger again. "My neighbor mentioned a man named Harold Grayson." Dr. Grant's expression changed immediately. "You've already met him?" Luke nodded. "He claims my grandmother owed him money." The veterinarian shook her head slowly. "That doesn't sound right." Luke leaned forward. "What do you mean?" Dr. Grant hesitated before answering. "Eleanor came to see me last year," she said. She seemed worried. Luke felt his stomach tighten again. "About Grayson?" "Doctor." Grant nodded. "She said he kept asking questions about her workshop." Luke stared at the floor. "That makes two of us." Dr. Grant walked to a small refrigerator and pulled out an ice pack. "Take this for Ranger," she said. Then she paused. "There's something else." Luke looked up. "Eleanor left something here." She opened a drawer and removed a small envelope. "She asked me to give it to you if you ever came back." Luke stood slowly. "For me?" Dr. Grant handed it over. "Only If you were alone, she added quietly. Luke opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a memory card. No note, just the small black card. Luke felt Ranger nudge his leg gently. Dr. Grant noticed. Looks like he's ready to go home. Luke nodded. Yeah. He helped Ranger down from the table. The dog walked slowly but steadily. Strong, always strong. A few minutes later, Luke and Ranger stepped back out into the snowy night. The storm had begun to ease. Luke sat in the truck for a moment before starting the engine. The memory card rested in his hand. Ranger climbed into the passenger seat carefully. Luke looked at the dog. Let's see what she wanted me to know. They drove back through the quiet town and into the mountains again. The storm clouds began to break. Moonlight reflected across the snow-covered valley as Carter Farm came into view. Luke parked beside the barn. The workshop lights flickered on again as he stepped inside. Everything looked exactly as he had left it. The wooden box still sat on the workbench. The laptop still waited on the desk. Luke inserted the memory card. The screen flickered. Eleanor Carter appeared again. But this video was different. She looked more serious than before. The workshop behind her was dark, except for a single lamp. Luke, she said, if you're watching this, it means things have already begun. Luke leaned closer. Eleanor folded her hands. You're going to hear a lot of lies about me. Her eyes looked straight into the camera. But there's one thing you must remember. She reached down and held up a piece of paper. My signature. Luke frowned. You see the mark beneath the letter E? The camera zoomed slightly closer. A small dot sat just beneath the letter in her name. I always sign my contracts with that mark, Eleanor explained. It's my way of knowing the signature is real. Luke felt his heartbeat quicken. Eleanor's voice lowered. If someone shows you a contract without that mark, she leaned closer to the camera. Then you know it's a lie. Luke's eyes widened slowly. He thought about the papers Harold Grayson had shown him in the barn. The supposed debt. The contract with Eleanor's signature. Luke replayed the memory in his mind. There had been a signature, but no mark beneath the E. Luke looked at Ranger. The dog wagged his tail slowly. Luke turned back to the screen. But Eleanor had one final message. And Luke. She smiled softly. The truth you need is already hidden in the barn. The video ended. The workshop fell silent again. Outside, the snowstorm had stopped. Luke leaned back in the chair. For the first time since arriving at Carter Farm, he knew one thing for certain. Harold Grayson had lied. And somewhere inside this barn, his grandmother had left the proof. Luke Carter sat motionless in the wooden chair for a long moment after the video ended. The workshop had fallen quiet again. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the Bitterroot Valley buried beneath fresh snow. Moonlight filtered through the high windows of the barn, casting pale silver across the wooden floor. Ranger lay beside the workbench, resting carefully on his uninjured side. The bandage around his shoulder was clean, but thick, the white cloth standing out against his dark fur. Luke looked down at him. You should be resting. Ranger thumped his tail softly, but didn't move. Luke leaned forward and replayed Eleanor's final words in his mind. The truth you need is already hidden in the barn. He slowly stood up. The workshop suddenly felt different. Not just like a place where furniture had been built, but like a puzzle, waiting to be solved. Luke walked toward the workbench, where the small wooden box still sat. The carved words on its lid caught the lantern light. For Luke, when you are ready, he picked it up again. The box was heavy, solid walnut, built with the same care Eleanor had used for every other piece in the workshop. But the lock still refused to turn. Luke pulled the rusty key from his pocket and tried again. The key slid in easily, but the mechanism wouldn't move. Still not ready, Luke muttered. Ranger watched him. The dog lifted his head and sniffed the air. Luke noticed. What is it, boy? Ranger slowly pushed himself to his feet, despite the bandaged shoulder. The dog limped slightly, but moved with determination. Luke frowned. Easy. But Ranger ignored him. The German Shepherd walked across the workshop floor toward the large wooden desk where Eleanor had recorded her videos. He lowered his nose and began sniffing carefully along the base of the desk. Luke watched him. You smell something? Ranger's tail wagged once. Then the dog scratched lightly at the floor beside the desk. Luke stepped closer. The boards looked normal at first glance, but Ranger kept pawing at one particular spot. Luke crouched down. The lantern light revealed something he hadn't noticed earlier. A faint outline. A narrow seam in the wood. Luke ran his fingers along the edge. The board shifted slightly. Well, I'll be. He grabbed a nearby chisel and carefully pried upward. The plank lifted free. Beneath it was a small hidden compartment built directly into the floor. Inside lay a thin metal box. Luke carefully removed it. Ranger sat beside him, watching closely. The metal box had no lock, only a simple clasp. Luke opened it slowly. Inside were 3 items. A leather-bound notebook, a folded document sealed in plastic, and a small brass key. Luke stared at it. Now, that looks promising. He picked up the key. It was smaller than the rusty one he'd found in the envelope. Newer, carefully polished. Luke walked back to the workbench. Ranger followed him closely. Luke placed the wooden box down and inserted the brass key. The lock turned immediately. A soft click echoed through the quiet barn. Luke lifted the lid slowly. Inside the box lay several thick folders wrapped neatly in cloth. Luke opened the first one. Documents, contracts, receipts, letters from lawyers. Each one carefully dated and organized. Luke scanned the first page. His eyes widened. The document described multiple complaints filed against Harold Grayson. Fraud, forgery, property disputes. Luke flipped through the papers quickly. Every case told the same story. Grayson had approached elderly landowners across western Montana. He offered them business deals, construction investments, furniture commissions, anything that required signing legal contracts. Then, years later, he returned with claims of unpaid debts. Most of the victims had been too old or too poor to fight back. Luke clenched his jaw. He's been doing this for years. Ranger sat quietly beside him. Luke opened the second folder. More contracts, more forged signatures. Each one highlighted in red ink. Eleanor had carefully circled every fake. Luke turned to the final document. This one was different. It was the contract Grayson had shown Luke earlier, the same one claiming Eleanor owed $35,000. Luke studied the signature at the bottom. Eleanor Carter. He leaned closer. The letter E was there, but beneath it, there was no mark. Luke slowly leaned back. You were right, Grandma. Ranger wagged his tail softly. Luke flipped open the leather notebook. Inside were Eleanor's handwritten notes, dates, meetings, descriptions of every conversation she had with Grayson. Luke stopped at one particular entry, written only weeks before her death. Grayson came again today. He keeps asking about the barn. I believe he thinks something valuable is hidden here. Luke looked around the workshop. The tools, the furniture, the quiet mountain farm. What exactly were you protecting? Luke whispered. Ranger suddenly stood. The dog turned toward the barn doors again. His ears perked. Luke followed his gaze. The night outside had grown quiet again. Too quiet. Luke stepped toward the doorway and looked out across the snowy valley. Moonlight stretched across the fields, Everything appeared peaceful. But Luke knew better now. Grayson wouldn't give up easily. He had already sent men once, and now Luke had something those men had been searching for. Proof. Luke closed the wooden box and gathered the documents. Ranger limped back beside him. Luke knelt and scratched behind the dog's ears. "You did good tonight." Ranger leaned against him. Luke looked back at the barn one more time. The workshop no longer felt like a mystery. Now it felt like a battlefield. But this time, Luke Carter wasn't fighting alone. And tomorrow morning, he planned to bring the truth to someone who could finally stop Harold Grayson, the sheriff. Morning arrived slowly in the Bitterroot Valley. The storm had left the farm covered in fresh snow that glowed pale gold beneath the rising sun. Pine trees stood heavy with frost, and the mountains in the distance looked calm again, as if nothing dangerous had ever touched the valley. But Luke Carter knew better. He stood on the porch of the farmhouse with a mug of coffee warming his hands. Ranger lay beside him, resting, but awake. The dog's bandaged shoulder was stiff, but his eyes were alert, following every sound across the property. Luke crouched beside him. "How you feeling?" Ranger's tail thumped once against the wooden boards. Luke scratched the dog behind the ear. "Yeah," he said softly. "I figured you'd say that." Inside the farmhouse, the evidence from Eleanor's wooden box lay spread across the kitchen table. Contracts, notes, letters, every page, carefully documenting Harold Grayson's schemes. Luke had barely slept, but he didn't need sleep. For the first time since arriving in Montana, he had a clear direction. He grabbed the stack of papers and stepped back inside. Ranger followed slowly. Luke placed everything into a large envelope. "We're going to town," he told the dog. Ranger wagged his tail again. The truck started with a low rumble. The road into town was quiet, snow crunching beneath the tires as Luke drove through the valley. The sheriff's office sat on the corner of Main Street, a small brick building beside the diner. Luke parked and stepped out. Ranger stayed in the truck, watching through the window. Inside the office, a tall man in a brown uniform looked up from his desk. Sheriff Tom Alvarez. His expression was calm but curious. "Morning," he said. Luke set the envelope on the desk. "My name is Luke Carter." The sheriff nodded. "I know the name. Eleanor Carter's grandson." Luke was surprised. "She talked about you once or twice," Alvarez said. "Good woman." Luke slid the papers across the desk. "I think someone's trying to steal her land." The sheriff opened the envelope and began flipping through the documents. His expression slowly hardened. "Where did you get all this?" "My grandmother hid it in the barn." Alvarez leaned back in his chair. "And Harold Grayson showed up already, didn't he?" Luke nodded. "He sent 2 men last night." The sheriff's eyes sharpened. "Did they threaten you?" "They tried to take something." Alvarez closed the folder. "Well," he said quietly, "this is interesting." Luke frowned. "You've heard about him before?" Alvarez nodded slowly. "Grayson's been on our radar for years. He tapped one of the contracts, but no one's ever had proof like this." Luke exhaled. "So, what happens now?" The sheriff leaned forward. "Now, we give Mr. Grayson the chance to hang himself." Luke raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Alvarez smiled faintly. "We set a trap." 2 hours later, Luke and Ranger were back at the farm. The valley was quiet again. Luke sat inside the barn workshop, while Ranger rested near the doorway. The wooden box sat on the workbench just like before, but now the sheriff and 2 deputies waited outside the property line where they couldn't be seen. Luke checked his watch. Grayson had said he would return, and right on schedule, a black SUV appeared at the end of the driveway. Ranger stood immediately. Luke looked down at him. "Easy." The vehicle rolled slowly across the snowy yard and stopped beside the barn. Harold Grayson stepped out. He looked calm, confident, just like the night before. Grayson brushed snow from his coat and walked toward the barn. "Mr. Carter," he called. Luke stepped into the doorway. Ranger stood beside him. Grayson smiled. "I trust you've had time to consider my offer." Luke nodded slowly. "I have." Grayson folded his hands. "And?" Luke held up the contract. "I want to talk about this." Grayson's eyes flickered toward the paper. "Of course." Luke stepped aside. "Come in." Grayson entered the workshop, glancing briefly at the tools and furniture. "Remarkable craftsmanship," he said. Luke walked toward the workbench. "You said my grandmother signed this contract." Grayson nodded. "She did." Luke pointed at the signature. "Look closely." Grayson frowned slightly. "I've seen it before." Luke shook his head. "Not closely enough." Grayson leaned forward. Luke tapped the letter E. "My grandmother always signed her name with a small mark beneath the E." Grayson's expression changed for the first time. "There's no mark here." The barn door opened behind him. Sheriff Alvarez stepped inside with 2 deputies, which makes this contract a forgery. Grayson turned slowly. The calm confidence drained from his face. "Sheriff," he said carefully. Alvarez held up the folder of evidence. "We've been looking for something like this for a long time." Grayson straightened his coat. "This is ridiculous." Luke crossed his arms. "Your men tried to break into the barn last night." The sheriff stepped closer. "You're under investigation for fraud and attempted property theft." Grayson looked around the workshop, as if calculating his options. Then Ranger barked sharply. The German shepherd stood directly between Grayson and the door. Grayson exhaled slowly. "Well," he muttered. Sheriff Alvarez placed a hand on his shoulder. "Mr. Grayson," he said calmly, "you're going to come with us." Outside the barn, the valley lay silent beneath the bright winter sun. And for the first time, since Eleanor Carter had died, justice had finally arrived at Carter Farm. The black SUV disappeared down the road between the sheriff's patrol trucks, its tires carving deep lines into the snow as it carried Harold Grayson away from the valley. The sound of the engines slowly faded. Then the farm fell quiet again. Luke Carter stood in the doorway of the barn workshop, watching the empty road long after the vehicles had gone. The mountains surrounding the Bitterroot Valley looked peaceful now. Fresh snow sparkled beneath the sunlight, covering every fence and pine tree in a blanket of white. Sheriff Tom Alvarez walked back into the barn. "Looks like that's the end of it," he said. Luke nodded slowly. "I hope so." The sheriff glanced around the workshop again. "Your grandmother was smarter than most people gave her credit for." Luke looked at the workbench, where Eleanor's wooden box still sat open. She knew he'd come eventually. Alvarez placed the folder of evidence back on the table. "With these records, Grayson's not walking away from this one." Luke leaned against the barn wall. "Good." The sheriff studied him for a moment. "You planning to stay?" Luke didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked around the workshop again. The tools still hung neatly along the walls. The unfinished furniture still waited beside the benches. Everything Eleanor Carter had built remained exactly where she left it. Luke felt Ranger press against his leg. The German shepherd had followed him quietly from the doorway. The dog's bandaged shoulder looked better already. Luke scratched behind Ranger's ear. "I think we might." Sheriff Alvarez smiled. "Well," he said, "this valley could use another Carter." The sheriff tipped his hat and walked out into the bright winter afternoon. Luke listened as the patrol truck started and drove away. Then he and Ranger were alone again. The silence inside the barn felt different now. Not tense, not threatening, just quiet. Luke walked slowly through the workshop. His fingers brushed across the smooth wooden surface of a finished table. He could almost imagine Eleanor standing beside him, explaining how she had shaped the wood grain to follow the natural lines of the tree. Luke picked up one of the chisels from the wall. The handle was worn smooth from years of use. He turned it over in his hands. "You did all this by yourself," he murmured. Ranger followed him as he walked deeper into the barn. Sunlight streamed through the high windows, lighting up the sawdust scattered across the floor. Luke stepped over to the wooden desk where Eleanor had recorded her videos. The laptop still sat there. The screen had gone dark. He pressed the power button. The computer came back to life. Luke opened one of the earlier video files again. Eleanor appeared on the screen, smiling gently as she worked at the bench. "Woodworking isn't about force," she explained in the video. "It's about patience." Luke watched for a while. Ranger lay down beside him, resting his head on Luke's boot. Outside, the afternoon sun slowly crossed the sky. For the first time in years, Luke felt something he hadn't expected. Peace. No gunfire echoing in his head. No memories pulling him back into the desert. Just the quiet sounds of the valley. The wind through the pine trees, the creak of the old barn beams, and Ranger breathing beside him. Luke closed the laptop and stood. "Come on." Ranger rose carefully. They stepped outside together. The snow had begun melting beneath the warm sunlight. The farmhouse looked less abandoned now, less like a place forgotten by time. Luke walked across the yard and sat on the wooden porch steps. Ranger lay beside him. The mountains stretched endlessly across the horizon. Luke rested his elbows on his knees. "You know," he said quietly to the dog, "I always thought I didn't belong anywhere." Ranger wagged his tail once. Luke smiled faintly. "Turns out I was wrong." He looked across the fields of Carter Farm. 80 acres of land. A barn filled with craftsmanship. A history he had never known. And a future he hadn't expected. Luke leaned back against the porch railing. The afternoon light faded slowly into evening. Ranger shifted closer and rested his head on Luke's leg. For the first time since leaving the Marines, Luke Carter closed his eyes and fell asleep without fear. The war in his mind had finally grown quiet, and in the peaceful silence of the Bitterroot Valley, Carter Farm had found its new guardian. Winter slowly loosened its grip on the mountains. Weeks passed. The deep snow that once buried the fields melted into clear streams that wound through the valley. The pines shed their heavy frost, and patches of green grass began pushing up through the earth around the Carter farmhouse. Life was returning to the land, and Luke Carter was learning how to live again. Every morning began the same way. The sun rising over the Bitterroot Mountains, coffee steaming in a metal mug, and Ranger sitting patiently on the porch, watching the valley like a silent sentinel. Luke had repaired the farmhouse roof first, then the broken fence along the north pasture. The work was slow, but it was steady. And for Luke, steady work meant quiet nights. The nightmares still came sometimes, but they no longer ruled him. On those nights when the memories tried to creep back in, Ranger would climb onto the porch beside him and rest his head against Luke's knee until the storm inside his mind passed. Luke would scratch behind the dog's ears and whisper the same words every time. "It's okay, partner. We're home." The barn workshop slowly came back to life as well. Luke spent hours inside the building Eleanor Carter had loved. At first, he simply cleaned, dusting the tools, organizing the wood planks stacked against the walls, repairing the workbench that had warped from years of Montana winters. But eventually, he began trying the craft himself. The first chair he built leaned slightly to one side. The second one held together better. By the third piece of furniture, Luke could almost hear Eleanor's voice guiding him. Patience, precision, respect for the wood. Ranger usually lay near the doorway, while Luke worked. But every so often, the German Shepherd would wander the barn, sniffing the floor as if remembering the day he first discovered the secret hidden beneath it. One afternoon, Luke placed the finished chair on the porch beside the farmhouse. He stepped back and studied it. It wasn't perfect, but it was strong. Ranger sat beside him, watching. "Well," Luke said, brushing sawdust from his hands, "Grandma would probably tell me to sand it down another hour." Ranger wagged his tail. Luke smiled. The valley was beginning to know his name. Walter Hayes, the old neighbor who had first greeted him when he arrived, stopped by one morning with a truckload of lumber. "Figured you might put this to better use than I can," the old man said. Luke thanked him. Soon after, a rancher from across the valley asked if Luke could repair an old kitchen table. Luke tried. The repair worked. Word spread. By early summer, Luke's workshop stayed busy. But something else began happening too. One afternoon, a pickup truck pulled into the Carter driveway. A man stepped out slowly. He was about Luke's age. His shoulders carried the same quiet tension Luke recognized instantly. Another veteran. The man introduced himself. "Name's Daniel," he said. "I heard you might be hiring." Luke studied him for a moment. He saw the signs, the distant look, the restless hands, the same battles Luke himself had fought after leaving the Marines. Luke gestured toward the barn. "You ever worked with wood before?" Daniel shook his head. "No." Luke smiled faintly. "Neither had I." They walked toward the workshop together. Ranger followed close behind, his tail wagging slowly. The next week, another veteran came. Then, another. Some stayed only a few days. Others stayed longer. Luke never asked many questions. He simply handed them tools, showed them how to sand a board, how to shape a joint, how to let their minds quiet while their hands worked. The workshop slowly filled with the sound of hammers and saws. Not chaos, just rhythm. Healing rhythm. One evening near the end of summer, Luke stood at the edge of the field beside Ranger. The sun was setting behind the Bitterroot Mountains, casting long golden light across the farm. The barn doors stood open. Inside, several veterans were still working at the benches. Laughter drifted through the air. Luke looked at the wooden sign, newly mounted beside the driveway. The letters were carved deep into the oak plank. Carter Farm. Built by family. Guarded by loyalty. Ranger sat proudly beneath it. Luke rested a hand on the dog's head. "You know," he said quietly, "you found all of this." Ranger glanced up at him. "If you hadn't started digging that day." Luke looked out across the valley, the farm, the barn, the future. None of it would have existed without that moment. Without the loyalty of one stubborn German shepherd. Luke knelt beside the dog and scratched behind his ears. "We made it, partner." Ranger leaned against him. The mountains stood silent and strong around the valley. A place that had once felt empty now held something far more powerful. Home. Luke Carter stood there for a long time as the last sunlight faded behind the Bitterroot peaks. And beside him, Ranger kept watch over Carter Farm, just as he always would. Together, at last, they were finally home. And maybe that's the real meaning behind this story. Sometimes life breaks us. Sometimes the past follows us for years. And sometimes the only thing that keeps us standing is the loyalty of someone who refuses to leave our side. For Luke, that someone was Ranger. A loyal German shepherd who never gave up on his partner. So before you go, I'd love to hear something from you. If you believe loyalty like Ranger's still exists in this world, just type 1 in the comments. And if you've ever had a dog that felt like family, type 0. Just a simple 0 or 1. I read as many of your comments as I can, and I truly love seeing where our viewers are watching from and the stories you share. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because here we share more stories about veterans, loyal dogs, second chances, and the quiet kind of courage that changes lives. Your next story is already waiting, and trust me, the next one might be even more incredible.